Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Today, I want to talk about the deep state, capital D, capital S. There's always been some fringy chatter about the deep state. Maybe you've heard about it and maybe it seems like a new thing. But in any event, it's not actually a real thing. Extreme conservatives and libertarians like those who formed the Michigan militia back in the 90s, or like Timothy McVeigh, who almost single-handedly blew up a huge federal building with lots of people, including tiny babies and children in it, have for years insisted that there's a very dark cabal of coastal elites at work behind the scenes against the American people. QAnon further popularized and propagated the idea, but took it to brand new levels of horror by spreading bug nuts theories about Democratic politicians and liberal billionaires trafficking children to drink their blood and harvest their precious adrenochrome so they can live forever. Oh my God. It's so fucking scary. Ronald Reagan's presidency represented an inflection point where conservatives who argued for states' rights and smaller government, both symbolic platforms that support white supremacist policies, for more on this, see slavery, galvanized their political agendas in attacks against the federal government as too large and bulky to ever effectively govern. So we should slough off all that dead weight and let the markets do their magic. It would enrich those brave and innovative leaders that pioneered in the market, stimulating the economy and trickling down to us hoi polloi drooling over in the corner. This is a sham and propagandistic rhetoric that serves one purpose: to consolidate power and wealth within a small section of people and keep it there. The federal workforce comprises the largest single employer workforce in the United States. This is the deep state. Nearly 4.5 million people are federal employees, including all agencies and military, including reserves. Michael Lewis, author of Moneyball and The Big Short, wrote a book about the federal government in the Trump administration called The Fifth Risk. And the overall message of his book is that people who work in government do so with integrity and a clear mission to serve. His book highlights the focus on good governance that exists throughout the federal workforce. Popular culture is great at caricaturing federal employees as lazy, complacent sponges, but the truth is very much the opposite. An example of this sort of thing is in the Trump administration, the initial appointee for the Secretary of Energy was the former governor of Texas, a man by the name of Rick Perry, who had run for president at one point. And during his campaign, he had declared loud and proud that the Department of Energy and the Department of Education and others should just be abolished, that they just did nothing. They were sort of just wasteful government spending, and they should not, the American people shouldn't be sort of burdened with paying for it. And then when he was appointed Secretary of Energy, to his credit, he got in there and started talking to the people that actually ran the place and discovered that there was a lot that that department did that was vital to the nation's security. Among other things, the protection, security, and preservation of our nuclear supplies. So there was a lot there, and he quickly backtracked on this. Abolished the DOE, and noted that the people that were running that agency were very much in it for the mission and were doing so at some risk to themselves, and there was a great deal of dedication to the integrity of the agency. One of the things that Michael Lewis cites in his book is an example that early in the Trump administration, we saw aggressive action to promote demagoguery. Like he was dipping a toe into the waters of dictatorship to check the temperature of people's appetite for autocracy. Not unlike, and again, I'm sorry for the Hitler comparisons, but not sorry. They're just like too available and too astute. Early in the Third Reich, Hitler and his regime attempted a Jewish boycott, and it didn't really work. They had, SA officers standing outside shops being like, this is a Jewish shop, and the people would be like, yeah, no fucking doy, I have an order here, get out of my way. So it just really didn't work that well, and the Third Reich then had to sort of recalibrate how they were going to roll out those policies. So similarly, Trump demanded a list of names from the Department of Energy staff, be given to his transition team of the DOE employees, the Department of Energy employees who were working on climate change related policy. The Department of Energy leadership, to their credit, refused to comply, but it was a pretty naked attempt to identify dissenters and unseat them and replace them with complicit candidates. Trump, in his campaign for the 2024 presidential election, has made open promises to gut the deep state. And what that really means is he intends to eviscerate the federal workforce and dismantle government. And he's not kidding. He has a bunch of little Rick Perrys running around talking about how much money is wasted on government without actually understanding what government is doing. And they don't seem to care at all about what government is supposed to be doing, namely governing. Then they go on TV and podcasts and radio shows and lie about what government is actually doing. And the people that trust them believe those lies. Here's what Trump has to say about the deep state over the last year during his campaign events. On March 25th, 2023, in Waco, Texas, on the 30th anniversary of the tragedy at Waco, Trump said, quote, "Either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state." In April, his campaign team announced their personnel strategy by releasing a list of initiatives they intended to achieve in the first 100 days in office. At the top of Trump's list is reinstituting an executive order known as Schedule F, which would reclassify tens of thousands of federal employees involved in policy decisions as at-will employees. In other words, they would lose their employment protections, and it would be much easier for a president to fire them. Oh, here's an interesting thing I heard recently about that first 100 days in office measurement you often hear spoken about in new presidential administrations. 100 days is the amount of time it took Hitler to dismantle the Weimar Republic from the time he was elected chancellor to the point where he took over total dictatorial power and the Third Reich was born. The more common narrative, and probably the more plausible narrative, which is also true, is that FDR's first 100 days was insanely productive, pushing through 15 pieces of major legislation that was broadly effective. But in the case of Donald Trump, I believe the former to be a more apt comparison. Trump's first stated mission as soon as he's inaugurated, assuming he's reelected, is to, quote, "overhaul federal departments and agencies, firing all of the corrupt actors in our national security and intelligence apparatus." According to Axios reporting in June of 2022, former President Trump's top allies were preparing to radically reshape the government if he's reelected, purging potentially thousands of civil servants and filling career posts with loyalists to him and his America First ideology. They intend to stack thousands of mid-level jobs. Well-funded groups are already developing lists of candidates, selected often for their animus against the system. In line with Trump's long-running obsession with draining the swamp, this includes building extensive databases of people vetted as being committed to Trump and his agenda. Yikes, that's bad. And also, really brazen. That's just a very brazen statement about how you're going to destroy democracy. Just openly saying, we're going to totally destroy democracy. That's bogus. Anyway, recent statements regarding suspension of the Constitution have been made. Gentle reminder, he means what he says. In December 2022, Trump posted online that it was, quote, "time for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution," end quote, in response to his claim that the election he lost was not a legitimate election because he lost. Hang on, I gotta call the ambulance. Like, sore loser much? Like, again, I'm sorry to like, retread well tread ground, but that's really what it all boils down to. He lost an election and he's pissed about it, and he refuses to accept it because he's a baby. Ick. I'm recording this on Sunday, October 1st, 2023. And as of 9 p.m. yesterday, the Senate, hooray, passed a bill to continue funding the government, narrowly averting a government shutdown. They've passed a continuing resolution that will fund the government, minus any funding to support Ukraine's defense against Russia's war against them, for the next 45 days, when we will probably repeat the entire process in some fashion. And there's some weak promise that they'll be able to bring Ukraine funding to the floor for a vote within that next 45 days. So I'm not holding my breath. The last shutdown was in 2019 during the Trump administration. It lasted for 35 days, and it was the longest in American history. And as a general note, like, this government shutdown exercise, not unlike its ugly cousin, the debt ceiling exercise, it's a bit of a rinse and repeat thing within American politics for at least the last decade. And it's really, really stupid. And it's really especially stupid because it's so parliamentary. Like, it's almost like purposely not intellectually accessible by average citizens who are just like trying to live their lives, right? It's just a lot of like bees hovering, buzzing around the hive. It's just, as a citizen, it's just like, come on, you guys, like, we have bigger problems here. Like, let's move past these, kabuki theater shenanigans and into like facing actual problems. I think like that's a general vibe I get from most people, like everyday people that I meet. Like, the idea that anybody really cares about all these theatrics and like performances in Congress, is really just not, no one gives a shit. They just want, they're just trying to live their lives and like pay their bills and like raise their kids and be happy. It's really like that simple. In addition to the federal workers that were affected in that last shutdown, and that shutdown wasn't total, so many federal workers continued to be paid throughout the shutdown. Also, 10,000 private companies were affected, like contractors. So the number of individuals who are negatively impacted by that is not like really quantifiable, both in terms of the people who didn't get paid for their work or who were furloughed, but also in terms of American citizens who lost federal benefits during that period or who were unable to gain access to government services. And we also weren't in the midst of a shaky economic recovery period right then as we are now. And, I'm very partial in this debate, like on the side of the position of like not shutting down government for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that, my spouse is a federal employee. So our income is cut in half during periods of shutdown. And it's like a full drag. This particular shutdown, which we just got passed, would have been a total government shutdown. And that means all military personnel as well are affected. So 52% of the federal workforce is Department of Defense and military. So for as long as the shutdown continues, members of the military and their families have to go without. That's not an exaggeration. Like, they would have to find other means of employment on the side, state assistance if they can get it, community support, but like they wouldn't be getting a wage for their, from their actual employer for whom they have to continue to serve. Another angle of the demagogish attacks against the federal workforce as the deep state is that there are always pressures to reduce the federal workforce as wasteful spending of a bloated bureaucracy and thereby reduce government spending and taxes. And it's goofy logic, since all of those jobs contribute to the economy by leaps and bounds. Again, 4.5 million jobs. And they contribute to economic like activity way more than they create an economic burden through taxation for those salaries. Like, it's like not a comparison. We're still displacing federal workers to private sector positions through, contractions of agencies, or like, the removal of federal work positions diminishes or removes entirely the protections that they would have enjoyed as federal employees. I mean, there's a federal workers union, the largest in the country. So their economic certainty is deteriorated, and subsequently every other aspect of their life, made a little more insecure. But there's reason for hope against the, promised doom of the death or the obliteration of the deep state, because, unions, they're back, baby. Within just the last 6 months to a year, we have seen strikes in the SAG-AFTRA, the writers' strike, and the Screen Actors Guild Award, or sorry, the writers' strike, the Hollywood writers' strike, and the Screen Actors Guild strikes, as well as the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, which is like one of the largest and oldest unions in the country. And the UAW strike recently made history because President Biden showed up at their picket line and spoke like in support of the workers. Like, no president has ever done that in history. So that's a major, presidents, Democratic presidents in particular, have always made overtures to be like very in support of labor. But showing up on a picket line is like next level shit. Like, it's pretty radical. It was awesome. But, historically, within very recent years, we've also seen really effective strikes from teachers unions, for example, in West Virginia, within Amazon, in a couple different states in the country, as well as Starbucks. We know that labor strikes are an incredibly effective tool to negotiate for workers' rights and leverage the power of collective action to improve workers' pay, workplace conditions, benefits, and much more. They happen pretty rarely within a historical context, but surges seem to occur in response to particularly egregious trends or practices undertaken by powerful corporations or private sector industry leaders. And one of the ways that strikes are successful, apart from the obvious effects of suppressing worker production to bring employers to the bargaining table, is that they demonstrate the power of collective action. And another is that they declare a position that favors individual workers, which is in direct conflict with the cultural programming that directs us to sublimate our own needs and preferences out of some misplaced gratitude for the opportunity to be employed. I don't know, internalized capitalism. And that declaration then really lends weight or support to sort of, privately held notions that some people may feel, but don't feel supported to be able to say out loud and like get out there to like take action on their own behalf. The internalized capitalism I just spoke of is, to use a phrase I spoke about recently, and that's spoken about in a book by the same name by Dr. Todd Rose, is a collective illusion. It's a mirage, and it's easily dissipated by the collective voices of workers who know for sure they are worth more than what capitalism delivers to them. Let's talk about the filibuster. Stay with me. It's related, I swear. A filibuster is a tactic used in the Senate to delay or block a vote on a measure by preventing debate on it from ending. Cloture is the process by which a filibuster may come to an end. It's a vote to end debate, and it requires at least 60 votes to pass. One thing I think a lot of Americans really don't get is that legislation is won in the margins. Elections are won in the margins. We've experienced largely predictable historical political divisions throughout our country's history. That includes two strong political parties that trade power back and forth or compromise on an agreed upon set of terms that partially satisfies both sides. That's the American political formula. Oh, sure, we've tried to throw new parties in there, like this doomed to fail No Labels Party or the Green Party, who continue to insist on existing. Adorable, but problematic. That's a fragile arrangement, and like most of our systems, it relies heavily on everybody just sort of agreeing that's the way things will be done. Right now, we only have one functional political party, and half of the country actively loathes and is or fearful of everyone in or associated with that party. It's the Democrats. I'm talking about the Democrats. The filibuster was never a rule in Congress, but its regular use to stymie meaningful popular legislation from being passed necessitated a rule that could allow it to be tempered. In 1917, the Senate adopted a rule by an overwhelming majority vote of 76-3 to allow cloture to be used to limit debate on a measure. The purpose of the filibuster is to kill popular legislation in order to maintain a minority grip on power. Senator William McClay of Virginia wrote of their tactics in the Congress in 1789 to resist any movement towards limitation of slavery, quote, "The design of the Virginians was to talk away the time so that we could not get the bill passed," end quote. Now, some conservative intellectuals, if such a thing exists anymore, will tell you that the filibuster ensures that a political majority can't overtake the government, thereby conveying irreparable harm to the opposing political constituency. Both Republican and Democratic Congress members have employed it since the formation of the Continental Congress. It's all bullshit, though, because since we have elections every 2 to 4 years, allowing legislation to pass by simple majority would not have a deleterious effect on the nation. I think this for a couple of reasons. First, and most obviously, it would allow for the majority of citizens' political desires to be made manifest. Like, that's the point. Just on mathematical terms, if a majority of members of Congress who represent their citizens in their districts are voting to enact legislation, then it's reasonable to conclude that it's representative of a majority of American citizens' desires who wish them to do so. If they enact legislation that's not popular in their districts, the odds of them being removed from that seat in the next election is much higher. Secondly, if unpopular legislation is enacted as a result of members' actions that don't represent their constituents, and if those members are subsequently removed by fair elections, then the unpopular legislation can very effectively be removed, undone, or otherwise mitigated against through passage of further legislation by a simple majority. It's all very straightforward, but for the pretzel-twisting logic imposed by politically motivated procedural rules that limit the Constitution. And it's this sort of political gamesmanship that causes American citizens to distrust the function of government and primes them to believe spooky stories about the deep state. Real quick, I want to talk about the conversation around geriatric leaders. Like, what is going on with the old people? Everybody's talking about it. You've got polls and media hyperventilating over this stated belief that voters don't want President Biden to run for re-election because he's too old. You've got a bunch of people wondering aloud why no one thinks Donald Trump is too old when he's only 2 years younger than President Biden and is also demonstrably crazy or cognitively impaired or some combination of the two. You've got Senator Mitch McConnell, leader of the Senate minority, who looks more and more like a desiccated corpse, freezing up twice in mid-sentence during different press conferences and not being able to release his death grip on the podium, and then coming back half an hour later to assure us that there's nothing at all to worry about. Move along. And you've got Dianne Feinstein dying in office after years of seriously debilitating health issues and leaving her seat vulnerable. I'm not trying to blame Dianne Feinstein, but you should have tapped out. Jiminy Cricket, when will we enact term limits in the Congress? But more importantly, Let's stop talking about people's age as though it's any sort of determining factor. It's not. Lots and lots of old people keep going and are as sharp and energetic as they ever were, even if they are limited by what their corporeal forms will allow as they approach their inevitable mortality. Dick Cheney, for example. Or look at Noam Chomsky. It takes that geezer half an hour to read a 3-sentence paragraph because all his body's energy is being deployed to keeping his head upright. But that paragraph is crystal clear and devastatingly astute every time. Or Bernie Sanders, who's 82 years old, older than both the president and Donald Trump. And no one has ever seriously questioned whether his age has impacted his ability to represent his constituents sufficiently, nor run for president twice. He's got moxie and it fuels memes and TikToks like he's a pop star. I happen to think President Biden has been leaning in a little bit on this old man Joe persona. Like, if you look at his schedule, I would be farking exhausted trying to keep up with what that man does every day and how much he travels and how he has to be prepared to answer all sorts of impromptu and tricky media questions just after having like long and sensitive policy discussions with like state governors or world leaders. You know, he seems tired to be sure. But he's just like, his administration is just like quietly behind the scenes, like chugging away, getting shit done. And I think that he's allowing the drama in Congress to divert attention so that he can just do what he got to do. That's what it feels like. He's not trying to have the spotlight right now. Passing historic legislation, making impactful speeches about the encroaching fascist takeover of our government, and keeping his mouth tightly shut about the totally unnecessary and politically motivated mission to utterly destroy his only living child, Hunter Biden. And hopefully, by extension, to destroy him, Joe Biden. I sometimes wonder if Republicans think that by pursuing this so hard, they'll impose enough stress on the president to cause some sort of health failure. I know that's rather conspiratorial and far-fetched, but these days, who the hell knows? It's just as likely as any other theory. I've come around to the notion that Biden has indeed been the man for the moment, but not because he's a charismatic politician like FDR or a bombastic bullheaded trustbuster like Teddy Roosevelt, but he's more like Lincoln, whose melancholic temperament made him well suited to carry the burden of a nation at war. Joe Biden's life has been formed by tragedy and sorrow and the necessity to keep going on behalf of others. His wife and daughter were killed in a car crash right before he was inaugurated into his first elected position. His eldest son died of brain cancer. His youngest son got caught up on substance abuse and criminal activity. He had to hold everything down and keep on going. And all he had left was his wife, his son, his faith, and his service. And that's basically the story of his presidency. The nation has endured blow after blow. There seems to have been no respite for nearly the last 10 years. People are suffering more and more, and the future looks really uncertain as we witness the effects of climate change, a war that teeters on the brink of a whole new world conflict, the looming threat of an ambitious would-be dictator, and the weakening of democratic institutions that would inhibit the rise to power of said would-be dictator. Things look dark and kind of hopeless, and President Joseph Robinette Biden is quietly toiling away in service to the American people, and no one seems to give a shit. What's that about? So just a moment of reflection to wrap up the general notion of all this, these threats that Trump makes, that the far right wing of the Republican Party are parroting and propagating against the deep state, are threats against you and me, and threats against democracy. and we should not let that happen. Hey, I haven't been doing regular outros because, well, it's just super awkward. It doesn't feel right. Right now, at least, there are too few of you listening to make it worthwhile. I'm not really on social media anymore because it's just like, I don't know, it gives me weird vibes. Um, I don't know. I don't want to talk about that right now. I should probably do a pod on social media like I threatened to do a while back. But I'm not ready to talk about it yet. My thoughts aren't well formed. But all that notwithstanding, I do have an email address, Susie makes a podcast at gmail.com. That's SUZI makes a podcast at gmail.com. And I do still have an active Instagram account. My notifications on it are still on, though I seldom look at it unless I have reason to do so. And it's also at Susie makes a podcast, SUZI makes a podcast. I do love to hear feedback about the pod from those of you who I've spoken to who have listened. I thank you so much for your feedback and your suggestions and your positive support. It means everything, really. I'm not even sure why I do this, but I do it because it's a place to put my thoughts, and I'm so grateful that people have responded to it positively. So please reach out if you're inclined to do so, by email, by Instagram, or if you know me, just personally hit me up. Also, I'm not much of a self-promoter, but if you know anyone who might like to hear me yapping on the things I yap about, please tip them to the pod. Share the love like I love you. Thanks for listening.